You know, there's certain phrases and songs that seem to just be especially inspired. I think Jim referred to this years ago, but the last phrase, when this journey comes to an end, I'll rest in your endless grace. That's what it's all about. Thank you for being here this morning. I'm going to read a little bit from Philippians 2. Paul writes to these Christians in Philippi, as you deal with one another, you should think and act as Jesus did. In his very nature, he was God. Jesus was equal with God, but Jesus didn't take advantage of that fact. Instead, he made himself nothing. He did this by taking on the nature of a servant. He was made just like human beings. He appeared as a man. He was humble and obeyed God completely. He did this even though it led to his death. Even worse, he died on a cross. I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. But first, take you through a little trip Julie and I took back in September. We were going to some national parks in Utah. And one night we stayed in some cabins just east of Zion National Park. At about 6,000 feet in elevation, the air was dry, clear, there was no moon. And we stepped outside, and from one horizon to the other horizon, the Milky Way galaxy just appeared before us. And I'd seen one other night like this before. I was 19, long before Julie and I were married, in northern Arizona. And through 36 years of marriage, she had had to listen to me recount that experience to many, many people. And she was very polite about it. But she admitted later that it was often, okay, it was awesome. But with me that night, she saw what I had seen. And what David, 3,000 years earlier, had seen. A sky that truly speaks to who God is. But, you know, even as much as we could see that night, many of the 300 billion stars that make up this galaxy, so many that they appear as milk or dust. There's so many of them and they're distant. As many as we can see with our eye, or as many as could be seen by the Hubble telescope that was put into orbit 20 years ago. A little over a year ago, they put into space a new telescope called the James Webb Telescope. And they describe some of these images are taken if you extend your arm and you put a grain of sand in your fingers. They look into that size amount of space, a little pinhole of space. And in that pinhole appear over 40,000 galaxies, over 40,000 collections of hundreds of billions of stars. It's staggering. And it really does speak to, as David wrote in Psalm 8, you know, what are we that the creator of this would care about us, would be mindful of us? What's the nature, what's the existence of a being that holds this in his hand, as the prophet said, like drops of water? In Psalm 104, the psalmist says, let all that I am praise the Lord, O Lord my God, how great you are. You are robed with honor and majesty. You are dressed in a robe of light. You stretch out the starry curtains of the heavens. David wrote in Psalm 19, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. Day after day, they continue to speak. Night after night, they make him known. They speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, yet their message has gone throughout all the earth and the world, and their words to all the world. Or in the words of a contemporary song, and as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. If creation sings your name, so will I. Well, Jesus was in the middle of this creative act, of this universe and the life that's within it. As John tells us, he was God. He was with God. Nothing that was made without him. He gave life to everything. In his own prayer in John 17, remember he says to the Father, glorify me with the glory that I had with you before the creation of the world. You know, these tremendous sights, whether on the scale within our bodies and what goes on, or at the size and scope of the universe, it speaks to the glory of God, and yet this is just a reflection of his glory. It just gives us a little glimpse of the nature and existence of Jesus and the Father and the Spirit. But how do you even imagine the being that controls and makes all this? Well, that's where I want to come back to Philippians 2. And remember and imagine as best we can this existence and the glory that we see of it. Paul tells us Jesus didn't hold on to it. He counted it as nothing, or as many versions say, he emptied himself of all those things. Now, he retained the essence of God, so much so that Paul could say he was the express image of God, so much so that he could tell the apostles, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And the details of how God and man merged together are way beyond any of us. But there are things that Scripture makes clear about what he gave up, how he emptied himself. And those are things I want us to think about for a few minutes. You know, one is he goes from this existence that we cannot imagine, and then he comes into this world. And we might think he could have come in the way Adam did. Maybe God took a rib from Joseph, from Mary, and formed a body that he inhabited. And in that way, it would have been literally like Melchizedek, that without father and mother. But that's not how he did it. He entered the world from this incredible existence. He entered the world the way we do. Think about it. Joseph and Mary had to carry and wash and clean and feed the maker of the universe. That had to cause them to pause many times and just wonder at God's great plan. Sometimes maybe we stand back and we're a little hesitant to be drawn into the emotion and the sentiment of Luke 1 and 2 and Matthew 1 and 2. But those stories, I think, are intended to speak to our hearts. They speak deeply to our hearts, but they also express deep theology. They're telling us God came and was subject to his own creation. He needed us. That's what emptying means. As he continues to grow, Luke says, he grew in stature and wisdom and knowledge. Now, wait a minute. Here, how does the creator of everything, who has all knowledge, grow in stature and wisdom and knowledge? We're also talking about the Hebrew writer. He learned obedience to the things which he suffered. Maybe the best expression of that is in Luke 4 and Matthew 4, where he goes into the wilderness and for 40 days doesn't eat anything. Lawrence, a couple of weeks ago, mentioned that series Alone. Lawrence and a couple other couples a few years ago had dinner with us, and we hadn't seen it. They mentioned it, so we watched it a little bit. And when you watch that, two things stand out. One is, like Lawrence said, the isolation and how it gets to people and affects people's mood and mind. But the other is the hunger. It doesn't take 40 days to get hungry. In fact, if you're looking for a post-New Year diet, lose a lot of weight fast, go 40 days without eating. Jesus goes 40 days. And all of this is set up, I think, to do what the Hebrew writer is talking about, to help him learn obedience, or maybe better put, prepare for his mission. It wasn't to bring him down, it wasn't to have him fail, but it was to build him up for a mission unlike any other mission. So after these 40 days, your mind and body are sapped and fogged, and Satan tempts him then, and he withstands that. But then he needs to be comforted. The Father needs to send the angels to comfort him. The one who was at his side making all the world now needs to be comforted by beings that were created by him. There are many other things we could talk about, but I'm going to skip over to the night before he was crucified. And he's taken prisoner, he's mocked, he's beaten to a pulp. And then on the road to the place of the skull, Jared and Shawnee mentioned this in their podcast a while back. I hadn't really given thought to this. It's a little story, but yet it speaks again to the deepest theology of Jesus' mission here. He can't bear the weight of the cross alone. He's going to save us, and yet he can't bear this weight alone, and so Simon is compelled to help him. And as Jared Johnny pointed out, think about that. He needed help from the very humans that he's in the process of saving. And then as he gets to the cross, and he's nailed, and he's lifted up, the sense of abandonment. He'd been praying the night before that he and the Father are one, and he sensed this feeling that he had of how close he was. But then later he prays to the garden, and he's anxious to an incredible extent, and he needs his friends. And the Father sends angels to comfort him then. But now hanging on the cross, he senses this distance from the one that he was one with and created all things with. After he'd been nailed to the cross by the very beings that he created, to a tree that he had made. And now he says the words, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" That is what empty means. That's what becoming nothing means. Yes, he gave his life. That's a huge thing. That's as much as we can give. But that was really the capstone, the climax of what he gave up. Again, come back to listen to what Paul says. In his very nature, he was God. Jesus was equal with God. But Jesus didn't take advantage of that fact. Instead, he made himself nothing. He did this by taking on the nature of a servant. He was made just like human beings. He appeared as a man. He was humble and obeyed God completely. He did this even though it led to his death. Even worse, he died on a cross. The death was violent, cruel, seemingly shameful, but it was the climactic event in Jesus' sacrifice. It wasn't the totality of it. This sacrifice began 30 years earlier when he entered this world as this tiny baby. You know, we're all familiar with this statement. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not be condemned. That's so familiar maybe that we don't fully appreciate it. I had forgotten that Jesus uttered those words himself. I thought that was John saying, this is what Jesus said. But he's saying this to Nicodemus. And in essence, he's telling Nicodemus, God loved this world enough that he sent me. He sent me, his only son, from his very side to save this world so it wouldn't be condemned. So I hope this morning that in contemplating Philippians 2, that you can think about how great the Son is, how much he gave up, what he sacrificed, and what he's calling us to remember as we come to this table. There's one more song I want to give you the words of, a few words as I finish, that I think expresses concisely the message that I'm trying to give this morning. You stood before creation, eternity in your hands, and you spoke the earth into motion, my soul now to stand. You stood before my failure and carried the cross for my shame. My sin weighed upon your shoulders, my soul now to stand. So I'll stand with arms high and heart abandoned in awe of the one who gave it all. I'll stand my soul, Lord, to you surrendered. All I am is yours. We'll ask the men to come forward now.